Sergei Voronin woke up every day in fear. For 10 years, his past had haunted him, and he kept hoping that sooner or later everyone would forget what he had done. But every time his eyes opened, he heard a low hum, as if someone was still chasing him. He had been an electrical engineer at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986 when the disaster occurred. But his tragedy wasn't in the reactor explosion. It happened later, in 2010, when Sergei decided to return to Pripyat, the ghost city, abandoned and forgotten, and steal something from the deserted buildings that he felt rightfully belonged to him. Sergei dreamed of the day he could return and find his old passion, a handcrafted clock with rare mechanisms. It had been left in the house of one of his former colleagues who had died after the accident from radiation exposure. Sergei knew the clock was worth a fortune and decided that taking it was his right. No one would dispute ownership in a city where no one lived anymore. He snuck into the exclusion zone through the forest, circumvented the guards, and approached the spectre of Pripyat under the cover of night. The city was empty, with only the wind blowing papers around the streets and rustling through old grass. Abandoned buildings, covered in dust and mold, looked like sinister phantoms. Sergei entered the building he needed, and it took him several hours to find the clock he was looking for. But, to his surprise, someone had already been in the room where it should have been. The clock was gone, and an empty box with a youth sticker was lying in the corner. Sergei's heart pounded in panic. He was sure that no one should have been there before him. But if someone had already been there, it meant they could have been watching him. Panic turned into sheer terror when he heard footsteps. Someone was undoubtedly approaching his door. Glancing around quickly, he noticed an old staircase leading to the attic. Without hesitation, he climbed up and froze in the shadows. Below, someone passed by, shining a flashlight. They weren't stalkers. They were people in civilian clothes. Security guards. Police. Sergei couldn't tell. He stayed in the attic until the light from the flashlight disappeared, then slipped out and found himself outside again. Now the main thing was to get out of the city, but the noise of footsteps he had heard earlier and the missing clock haunted him. His eyes kept scanning his surroundings. Wherever he went, he felt watched. Sergei reached the central square and stopped by the old Ferris wheel, which had once been a symbol of joy and fun, but now looked like a grim giant. Something clicked in his mind. There's no way out anyway, he thought. He decided to hide in the Ferris wheel, waiting for dawn, when he could better see those who were after him. He climbed into one of the cabins and covered himself with a blanket he had found in a nearby house. Fear and exhaustion took their toll, and Sergei fell asleep. But even in his sleep, nightmares intruded. He dreamed of figures in gas masks standing around the Ferris wheel, silently staring at him. He woke up with a jolt from the sound of footsteps. Someone was approaching the wheel. Sergei pressed himself against the cold metal of the cabin, trying not to make a sound. Below, two figures appeared. They exchanged short phrases and laughed. He could make out only a few words. Hiding somewhere here, and we'll catch him. His mind frantically searched for an escape route. He looked down at the empty square and tried to figure out what to do next. Right below him, near the base of the Ferris wheel, were a pair of figures standing in the darkness. Sergei didn't know what to do. If he moved, they might hear him. He spent the next few hours lying in one of the Ferris wheel's cabins. His heart was pounding, but he remained completely silent. Suddenly, he felt a strange dizziness, whether from exhaustion or radiation. He didn't know. It seemed he could even hear his own breathing, though it was becoming more uneven. Time passed slowly, and Sergei tried not to move, hoping that his pursuers would leave the square. But soon he realized they had no intention of leaving. The figures were still. Maybe they had just left people there to watch the wheel, thinking he would eventually come out. Realizing he needed to find a way out, he decided to take a risk and look down. Slowly peeking out from the cabin, he saw that the square was now empty. He carefully climbed down the metal structure of the wheel. Suddenly, he felt someone's presence behind him. Barely turning around, he saw a dark figure in a hood. Sergei froze, then took off running. He rushed through the city, weaving through abandoned buildings and leaping over the remains of cars. The figure chased him, moving quickly and not losing track. He turned a corner and ran into the old cinema, hoping to hide inside. Inside the cinema, it was dark, and the air was thick with dust. Sergei hid behind an old chair and tried to breathe quietly. He heard the door open, and then heavy footsteps entered. The hooded figure walked past, surveying the hall. Sergei held his breath. When the footsteps moved away, he decided to slip out. Barely outside, he stumbled upon a group of people. In front of him stood 3 men in uniform with rifles. "Freeze!" one of them shouted. Sergei froze, hands raised. They approached, tied his hands behind his back, and dragged him back toward the Ferris wheel. In the square, in front of the wheel, they forced him to his knees. One of the soldiers took out a radio and reported that they had found him. Sergei realized this was the end. Whatever happened next, he would never see freedom again. But something happened that he didn't expect. One of the soldiers removed his hood, revealing an elderly man in civilian clothes. He crouched down in front of Sergei and quietly said, "You're not the first to try hiding here, but I promise you, your story will remain here, in Chernobyl, forever." Sergei didn't know what that meant. He looked into the eyes of his interlocutor, and then everything went dark. Images flashed through his mind: old clocks, grim faces in gas masks, figures standing around the Ferris wheel. Sergei woke up again on the wheel. This time he was alone. Only silence around him and the rhythmic creaking of the old structures. He realized he would stay here forever, in this abandoned city, among abandoned people, in an abandoned life.